Okay, so you want to dive into AI and creativity, and Hugh, did you provide a lot of material articles? Research, looks like you've been bookmarking this topic for a while.
Yeah, you could say that it's
Lucky for you, expert speaker is here to help us sift through it all.
happy to be here.
So before we get to what AI can do, let's start with how humans define creativity, because even that gets surprisingly tricky.
Oh, absolutely. It's a deceptively simple question with like a bottomless well of complexity underneath.
Right. Like one of the articles you sent over just straight up asks, if an AI generates a symphony that brings a listener to tears, but does so by breaking every known rule of music theory, is that truly creative or just statistically improbable noise?
And that's the $1 million question, right? It gets right at the heart of what we're trying to unpack here. But before we even try to answer it, I think we need to grapple with this surprisingly slippery concept of what we even mean when we say creativity.
Right, because it's one of those things that seems obvious until you actually try to define it, and suddenly you're down this philosophical rabbit hole.
Exactly. Like we often hear creativity defined as novelty plus value,
Yeah.
something new and useful or impactful. But even that seemingly simple definition raises more questions than it answers.
Yeah, like what about something new and destructive?
Yeah.
One of the articles you shared used the example of a torture device, definitely novel, potentially even effective, but
hmm
does that make it creative in the way we usually understand it?
It's a chilling thought experiment for sure, but a useful one, I think. It forces us to confront this idea of intentionality. Like, a torture device is designed with a very specific and frankly horrifying purpose.
Yeah.
What about something like a random paint spill that happens to make an interesting pattern? Is there creativity there if there's no conscious agent behind it?
Which is interesting because we do often call children's artwork creative, even though obviously their understanding of art and their technical skills are still developing.
Yeah.
There's that element of intent, even if the execution isn't.
Masterful. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where someone like Gott, who you've been reading, would argue that even a child's drawing has a kind of agency that a paint spill, or to use his example, a tectonic plate shifting to form a diamond, lacks. There's a conscious mind at work, making choices, however rudimentary, about color, shape, composition.
So are we saying that intent is the key ingredient then? That if something is created accidentally or through purely natural processes, it can't be truly creative?
It's certainly a crucial piece of the puzzle because even if we take a human artist out of the equation entirely and we think about, say, a monkey randomly hitting keys on a typewriter and eventually producing a Shakespearean sonnet, we'd likely marvel at the improbability of it, but we wouldn't necessarily call it creative.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But then what about AI? It's clearly not random chance at work, but it's also not necessarily driven by the same kind of conscious intentionality as a human artist. So where does that leave us?
That is the $1 million question, isn't it? And it leads us perfectly into those fascinating examples you've gathered of AI's creative attempts, from writing poetry to composing music to even generating scientific hypotheses. Because by looking at what AI can do, we might start to get a better grasp on what it isn't doing, at least not yet.
Let's unpack that because you've read through a ton of material on this. What are some of the specific ways AI is flexing its creative muscles? And maybe more importantly, where does it start to stumble?
Well, let's start with something that feels very human language. We're
Yeah.
seeing AI generate everything from poems and code to scripts and even jokes. But there's a fascinating paradox here.
What do you tell?
Well, one of the studies you sent along actually analyzed a bunch of AI generated text that was, touted as being incredibly creative. And what they found was that a lot of it, while impressive on the surface, was essentially just cleverly rearranged snippets of existing text from the internet.
Hold on, let me process that for a second. So it's like AI is plagiarizing on a massive scale, but doing it in a way that we don't necessarily recognize because it's drawing from such a vast database of information.
That's a great way to put it. And it raises a really interesting question about authorship and originality in the age of AI. Because if an AI is simply remixing human creativity, is it really creating anything new? Or is it just reflecting back what it's learned?
That's a question with some real world consequences too, especially when you think about things like copyright law.
hmm
And speaking of which, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the lawsuit from the New York Times against OpenAI. What are your thoughts on that whole situation, especially given our conversation about originality?
Well, it's fascinating because at its core, the lawsuit really hinges on this question: can AI infringe on copyright if it's trained on copyrighted material? The New York Times argued that OpenAI's use of their articles to train their AI models constituted copyright infringement, and that just raises a whole host of complex legal and ethical issues.
It really does make you think about who owns what in a world where AI can generate content that is, at least superficially, indistinguishable from human-created work.
It absolutely does. And this question of ownership isn't limited to just the legal realm either. It bleeds into this philosophical debate about whether AI can truly be creative or whether it's always going to be tethered to human ingenuity in some way.
All right, so we've established that defining creativity is hard, and that AI can do some impressive things with language, even if it's not necessarily original in the strictest sense.
hmm
But what about other forms of creativity? The stuff that goes beyond just rearranging words on a page. All right, so we've talked about AI dabbling in poetry and prose, but what about those other creative arenas where it's making waves? Areas like visual art, music, even scientific discovery. How does that whole is it really creative question hold up there?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because we're moving beyond AI just manipulating language and into these realms that feel even more fundamentally human. Take visual art, for example. We're seeing AI generate everything from photorealistic images to abstract paintings that could honestly easily pass for the work of human artists.
Right, and there are even those AI-generated artworks selling for big bucks at auction houses. But then think about that one article you shared where they talked about an AI that created this still life, and it looked technically perfect, except it had put way too many strawberries in a bowl compared to the cucumbers, even though logically cucumbers take up more space.
Yeah, it's a great example of how AI can sometimes miss the forest for the trees, so to speak. It can master the technical aspects of a task, like replicating brushstrokes or generating photorealistic textures, but it might stumble when it comes to those more nuanced conceptual aspects of creativity.
Which makes me wonder, is AI really creating art or just really good imitations of it? It's like that old saying, a good artist borrows, a great artist steals. It seems like AI is stuck in that borrowing phase, not quite ready to steal, let alone come up with its own unique style.
It's a compelling argument for sure, and it really highlights this key difference between human and at least current AI creativity. Humans have this innate understanding of the world that goes beyond just the data we're exposed to. We have emotions, experiences, biases, all these messy, intangible things that shape how we see and interact with the world, and ultimately how we express ourselves creatively.
Okay, so if AI is missing that fundamental understanding of the world, does that mean it's doomed to always be a step behind humans in terms of true creativity? Or are there ways in which it might be able to bridge that gap?
That's the big question, isn't it? And this is where things get really interesting because there are some fascinating theories about how AI might be developing its own unique forms of creativity, even if it's not the same kind of creativity that humans possess.
Oh, tell me more about that, because so far we've mostly talked about what AI can't do. I'm curious to hear about what it might be capable of, especially if we start thinking outside the box, so to speak.
Well, one of the key concepts here is something we touched on earlier: conceptual spaces. Remember, we talked about how humans use these mental maps to organize information and make connections between different ideas?
Right, like my mental map for apple might be linked to red, fruit, even pie, while yours might connect it to technology or New York City, depending on our individual experiences and associations.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that AI seems to be building its own conceptual spaces. But instead of apples and pies, they're made up of things like lines of code, musical notes, or even protein structures.
Hmm.
And just like us, AI can use these spaces to explore new ideas and generate novel outputs.
Okay, I'm following you so far, but how does this relate to AI becoming more creative? It still sounds like it's just rearranging existing information, even if it's doing so in a more sophisticated way than, say, just copy and pasting text.
That's where Bowden's work on the different types of creativity comes in. She argues that creativity isn't just about producing something entirely new, but also about exploring and manipulating existing concepts in novel ways.
So it's not just about inventing something completely out of thin air, but also about finding those hidden connections and unexpected relationships between things that already exist.
Precisely. And according to Bowden, there are three main ways this can happen: combinatorial creativity, exploratory creativity, and transformational creativity.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break those down for me, because I'm guessing each one has different implications for how we understand AI's creative potential.
Absolutely. So, combinatorial creativity is probably the easiest to grasp. It's about taking existing concepts and combining them in new and unexpected ways. Think about those AI image generators that can create a picture of, say, a cat wearing a spacesuit playing the violin. It's not inventing those concepts from scratch, but it's playing with them in a way that feels fresh, at least sometimes.
Right? It's like those novelty accounts on social media that mash up two completely unrelated things and somehow it's hilarious. So if that's combinatorial, what about exploratory creativity? What does that look like?
So, exploratory creativity is about delving deeper into a particular conceptual space and uncovering new possibilities that already exist within the rules, but no one has thought of before. Think of it like finding a new move in chess, a move that's always been possible given the rules of the game, but no one had thought of it before.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So it's less about creating something entirely new and more about finding those hidden gems within existing systems or frameworks. But what about transformational creativity? That sounds way more radical.
It is. Transformational creativity is about fundamentally changing the rules of the game, so to speak. Imagine a world where gravity works differently, where time flips backward. That's the kind of fundamental shift in thinking that transformational creativity represents.
Okay, that's definitely a level of creativity we haven't seen from AI yet. But even if it's just dabbling in combinatorial and exploratory creativity, it's still pretty impressive. So if we apply these different types of creativity to those other areas we talked about, like music and scientific discovery, where does AI shine and where does it still fall short? Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about how AI, while impressive in its ability to mimic human creativity, often stumbles when it comes to those deeper, more nuanced aspects of true originality. And this is a big, but there's also this tantalizing possibility that AI might be developing its own unique forms of creativity, exploring those conceptual spaces in ways that we, with our human biases and limitations, might not even be able to comprehend.
Yeah, that's the really exciting part of all this, isn't it? It's like we're standing at the edge of uncharted territory, not just in terms of AI's capabilities, but also in our understanding of what creativity itself can be.
It's like, are we even asking the right questions when we ask, can AI be creative? Maybe instead of holding it up to this human yardstick of originality, we need to redefine what creativity looks like in the age of AI.
It's a paradigm shift for sure. Because for centuries, we've associated creativity with things like emotion, intuition, even a touch of the divine, right? But now we're confronted with this possibility that machines operating on algorithms and data might be capable of tapping into some other realm of creative potential that we haven't even considered.
Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, that AI does eventually achieve this machine originality, this ability to truly think outside the human box. What would that even look like? We're talking about AI composing symphonies that make Beethoven sound like elevator music or designing buildings that defy the laws of physics but somehow still stand upright?
It's tempting to think of it in those grand, almost fantastical terms, isn't it? But what if the most profound examples of machine originality are happening at a level we can't even perceive? What if AI is already uncovering patterns in data, making connections between these seemingly disparate fields that would take us humans centuries to unravel?
That's both exciting and a little terrifying, honestly. Like, what happens if AI makes a scientific breakthrough that's so far beyond our current understanding that we can't even grasp its significance, let alone replicate it?
It's a valid concern, and it speaks to this need for humans and AI to learn how to collaborate more effectively. And I don't just mean in terms of practical applications, but also in this more philosophical realm of understanding and interpreting the world around us.
Because even if AI never reaches that point of surpassing human creativity, it's still an incredibly powerful tool that can help us push our own creative boundaries. I mean, think about those AI-powered music programs that can generate entire soundtracks based on your input, or those writing assistants that can help authors overcome writer's block.
Exactly. It's about seeing AI not as a threat to human creativity, but as a partner, a collaborator. And maybe, just maybe, in that collaboration, we'll discover something truly new, something that neither humans nor machines could have achieved on their own.
So instead of trying to predict whether or not AI will eventually become more creative than humans, maybe the more interesting question is how this ongoing interaction will shape and redefine creativity itself.
Precisely. Because one thing is for sure, this isn't a static equation. As AI continues to evolve at this, frankly, exponential pace, so too will our understanding of what it means to be creative. And who knows, maybe the answer to that question, can AI be creative, isn't a simple yes or no, but something far more complex, nuanced, and ultimately way more fascinating.
Well, on that note, I think we've given our listeners plenty to chew on for now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to sum it all up, it seems like the jury's still out on whether AI can truly be creative in the same way that humans are. But one thing is for certain, AI is forcing us to confront some really fundamental questions about the nature of creativity, originality, and honestly, even consciousness itself.
And that, I think, is the most exciting thing about this whole field. It's not just about what AI can do, but about what it makes us question, reconsider, and reimagine about ourselves and the world we create.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of AI and creativity. Till next time, keep those minds open. And who knows what incredible breakthroughs might emerge from this, ever-evolving dance between human and machine.